An invitation has been extended, and I indicated that I look forward to accepting that invitation, yes.
I don't think there's a prime minister out there who would have been in a position to have some kind of a reset of the relationship immediately.
Yesterday, President Xi of China and I had the first formal meeting between the leaders of our two countries in nearly 8 years.
After years of silence, it finally happened. Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney and China's President Xi Jinping came face to face for the first time.
We agreed this meeting marked a turning point in our bilateral relationship.
No virtual calls, no distant statements, just a real private conversation between two leaders whose countries haven't trusted each other in years. The meeting took place during the APEC Summit in South Korea, and both sides called it a turning point.
The meeting today is long overdue. We now have a turning point in the relationship, a turning point that creates opportunities for Canadian families, for Canadian businesses, and Canadian workers.
But here's the question everyone's asking. A turning point for what? For trade, for politics, or for something much bigger? Because behind the polite smiles and handshakes, this meeting could quietly reshape the future of Canada's economy, its alliances, and its role on the world stage. The meeting and the lines everyone quoted. It finally happened. After years of cold silence, Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney and China's President Xi Jinping sat down face to face. The meeting took place in Gyeongju, South Korea, on the sidelines of the APEC Summit, and both sides called it a turning point. Now, that phrase got everyone talking. A turning point for what exactly? For years, relations between Canada and China have been tense, almost frozen. There were trade fights, political drama, and even accusations of interference. So when the two leaders actually smiled and shook hands, it wasn't just a photo, it was a signal that something might finally be changing. According to official readouts, the talk lasted about half an hour, but what happened inside that room could shape the future of Canadian farmers, exporters, and the economy itself. Xi reportedly told Carney that China is ready to look forward, and Carney agreed that it's time to rebuild stable and respectful relations. Simple words, but in politics, those words can carry millions of dollars in meaning. Here's the part that caught headlines. Xi invited Carney to visit China, and Carney accepted, though no date has been set. That's a big deal because it would be the first official visit by a Canadian leader in nearly a decade. It's the kind of invitation that suggests Beijing might be ready to reopen some doors, especially after years of trade restrictions on Canadian goods like canola, pork, and seafood. Still, not everyone is convinced this meeting changes much. Some analysts say it's more about symbolism than substance. Basically, both leaders wanted to show they're being diplomatic without promising real action yet. There were no announcements about lifting tariffs or trade bans, no major deals, just warm words and a handshake. But even a handshake matters. It means both sides are willing to talk again, and in global politics, talking is the first step before trading. So yes, this could be the start of a thaw, a cautious one. The cameras caught the smiles, but behind those smiles are years of mistrust and tough questions waiting to be answered. And that brings us to the next big part of the story. The real pain that started all of this. The tariffs, the farmers, and the billions lost in trade. The real pain, tariffs and farmers. To really understand why this meeting mattered, you've got to look back at what pushed Canada and China apart in the first place. Because for many Canadians, especially farmers, this wasn't just politics. It hit their wallets. A few years ago, China was one of Canada's biggest trading partners. Billions of dollars flowed through deals involving canola, soybeans, pork, and seafood. But then, everything went downhill. Disputes over politics, arrests, and accusations caused Beijing to slam the brakes on Canadian imports. Suddenly, shipments were being rejected, and Canadian producers found themselves stuck with tons of products they couldn't sell. Take canola, for example. It's one of Canada's top exports, and China used to buy nearly half of it. But after tensions flared, China blocked shipments, claiming they didn't meet quality standards. Farmers back home didn't buy that excuse. They believed it was political payback. Fields that once made profits suddenly became reminders of how fragile international trade can be. And it wasn't just crops. The pork industry took a hit. hit too. Shipments were halted, inspections tightened, and costs piled up. Smaller farms couldn't keep up. Some were forced to close, while others looked desperately for new buyers in Europe or Southeast Asia. But replacing China's massive market wasn't easy. By the time Mark Carney took office, those wounds were still fresh. So when he met Xi and talked about rebuilding trust, Canadian farmers were listening closely. They weren't interested in speeches or smiles. They wanted access back to China's market, because no matter how many trade deals Canada signs elsewhere, China remains a heavyweight buyer that can make or break an entire sector. But here's the twist. While Canada was losing billions, other countries were cashing in. Nations like Brazil and Argentina stepped in to fill the gap, selling their soybeans and grains to China. That meant China didn't feel much pressure to make up with Canada. They had plenty of options. So now the big question is, can Carney actually turn things around? Or is this just a photo op with no real results? Because as we're about to see, what's happening behind the scenes might be even more complicated than anyone expected. And it involves some powerful countries that don't want Canada getting too close to Beijing again. Here's where things get tricky, because when it comes to Canada's relationship with China, there's always another player in the room, the United States. And whether Ottawa admits it or not, Washington's shadow is hard to ignore. For decades, Canada's economy has been tightly linked to the US. Almost 75% of Canadian exports go south of the border. So when the US decides to take a tough stance on China, Canada often gets caught in the middle. And lately, America's tone toward Beijing has been anything but friendly. Since Donald Trump's presidency, the US has been locked in a trade and tech war with China, one that Joe Biden didn't exactly end. From tariffs to restrictions on technology, Washington has made it clear that it wants to limit China's global influence. So when Mark Carney sits down with Xi, he's not just talking to China's president, he's stepping into the middle of a global power game. That's why every word, every handshake, and every friendly comment matters, because the US is watching closely. American officials don't want one of their closest allies suddenly cozying up to China, especially when tensions in the Pacific are heating up over trade routes, military presence, and rare earth minerals. But Canada has its own reasons to play it smart. Relying too heavily on one country, even the US, can be risky. The global economy is shifting fast, and China's market is just too big to ignore. That's why some experts say Carney's strategy isn't about choosing sides, it's about balancing power. Still, that's easier said than done, because whenever Canada tries to rebuild relations with Beijing, Washington raises an eyebrow, and when Ottawa leans too close to Washington, Beijing pushes back. It's a constant tug of war, with Canadian industries caught in the middle. So when you see photos of Carney and Xi smiling for the cameras, remember, this isn't just diplomacy, it's a high-stakes balancing act that could redefine where Canada stands in the global economy. But the real question is, how far is Carney willing to go? Because the next moves might determine whether this new turning point becomes a breakthrough or another diplomatic dead end. The turning point or a diplomatic mirage? So after all the talk, the smiles, and the headlines calling it a turning point, everyone's asking the same question. Is this the start of something real or just another diplomatic mirage? On paper, the meeting between Mark Carney and Xi Jinping sounds like progress. The words mutual respect and rebuilding trust were thrown around, and the tone was definitely warmer than it's been in years. But if you look closer, the details are still missing. No trade deals signed, no bans lifted, no specific promises. It feels more like a test of trust than an actual agreement. Analysts are split. Some believe this is just the first step, that both sides need time to rebuild confidence before diving into trade. Others say it's all show, that China's real focus is on larger powers like the US and the European Union. From that view, Canada might just be a small piece in a much bigger puzzle. But here's where it gets interesting. China has reasons to play nice too. Its own economy has been slowing down, and it needs reliable partners for energy, agriculture, and resources. Canada, with its natural wealth and stable economy, fits perfectly into that picture. So while China may not be rushing into new deals, it's keeping its options open. And that's exactly what this meeting was about. For Carney, this is also personal. He's stepping into the world stage with a reputation as a cautious, strategic leader. Rebuilding ties with China could boost his image as a global dealmaker, someone who can balance diplomacy, business, and national interest. But it's a delicate game, One wrong move, and he risks backlash from both the US and critics at home who still remember past tensions. So, what's next? That's the big unknown. Maybe this was just a warm-up for bigger talks in Beijing later this year. Or maybe, like so many diplomatic breakthroughs, it'll fade once the cameras move on. Either way, this meeting has set something in motion. And whether it's real progress or political theater, it's clear that Canada and China are talking again. And in today's tense world, even that's a small victory worth paying attention to. A careful reset. So was this meeting a real breakthrough or just smart diplomacy? Honestly, it's too early to say. What we do know is that after years of silence and tension, Canada and China are finally talking again, and that alone shifts the energy. Mark Carney's challenge now is to turn handshakes into action, because for farmers, exporters, and everyday Canadians, words don't pay the bills. Results do. Still, this moment shows that global politics can change fast, and even the coldest relationships can thaw when both sides see value in it. Maybe this really is the start of a careful reset, one that could rewrite how Canada plays on the world stage. Or maybe it's just another photo op. Either way, what happens next will show whether Carney's diplomacy is bold enough to truly reshape Canada's future.